Hello everyone, welcome to your week 5 revision activities video. Today we're going to be focusing on 1940s America, so this will focus a lot on the Second World War and how that impacted the United States. As always, you'll want this worksheet that you should be getting from your teachers. It will include these questions on some of the key information you'll need on this period of history. And then there is an exam style question. This one is, in what ways were the lives of African Americans and women changed by the Second World War? So to answer this question, you'll need to write one PEE paragraph on women and one on African Americans, so 2 PEE paragraphs. You'll need to include lots of, so 2+ specific detailed examples in those paragraphs as support. Those should include names, events, statistics, dates, but the more information and the more specific, the better. You'll also need to include an explanation of how their lives were changing and not just describing what happened to them. So you can't just say that this happened to African Americans. You need to explain how that changed their lives as a consequence. For top marks, you'll need to show complex thinking. And one way you can do that is to consider the short and long-term impacts. For example, women returned to the home at the end of the war and gained confidence, leading to the later feminist movement. So that can be an example of the kind of long-term impacts that you could consider in your answer. You'll also want page 44 of 40 to 49 of the revision guide to help you fill in this sheet, which you should also have gotten from your teachers. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and go away and have a go at completing this sheet. So all of the questions and the exam question on your own, and then come back to the video and I'll talk you through a completed version that I've done. All right, so welcome back. We'll get on to the completed version here. So we'll start off with this one. So this is America at War. So the first question is asking you to think about what is meant by the phrase America followed an isolationist policy in the 1930s. And what that is America kept out of the affairs of other countries. For example, the 1935 Neutrality Act banned loans to countries at war. So basically, in the 1930s, America did their best to stay out of foreign affairs of other countries. So the war starts in 1939, but America wasn't involved in the war until 1941. But how did they assist Britain before this? So there are a few different ways. In November 1939, Britain and France began buying weapons, warships, and planes from the US, known as the Cash and Carry Plan. And then in March of 1941, Roosevelt agreed to the Lend-Lease deal with Britain, where he would lend up to $700 million worth of weapons, knowing it was very likely they would never be paid back for those weapons. So they were essentially giving them away. And why did America eventually get into the war? So what caused them to completely abandon their isolationist foreign policy? And it was the Japanese attack on the American naval base in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. The attack caught Americans by surprise, and the next day they declared war on Japan. 3 days after this, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, so the other Axis powers, declared war on America, which meant that America was now fully involved in the Second World War. So, with that in mind, what is the social impact of the Second World War? So this question asks you to focus on the social impact on women and the social impact of African Americans. We'll go through women first and look at before or at the start of the war. So women at this time were in traditional female jobs primarily, such as nursing and teaching. And in 1940, 12 million women were members of the workforce. So it wasn't very common for them to work, and when they did, they were in very traditionally female jobs. So what changed during the war? As more men went to fight, women had to fill their roles in the workforce, doing jobs in factories, railways, shipyards. Eleanor Roosevelt urged her husband's Franklin Roosevelt, the president, to approve the US's government's first childcare facilities in 1942 to assist those women that are working in the workforce now. There are also women that joined the military in non-combat roles, such as the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, which are the WASPs, who flew planes from factories to military bases. African American women, so kind of crossing over with the other section here, struggled to find jobs in the defense industry and often found that white women were unwilling to work with them when they did. And also, black nurses were only allowed to treat black soldiers during the war. So there was still that segregation in the workforce between white and black women, even though more women were involved in the workforce in general. By the end of the war in 1945, women made up 1/3 of the workforce, so a much higher percentage than before. Many men still had prejudices against women in well-paid jobs, especially married women, and returning soldiers often expected life to be as it had been before the war and expected their wives to return to domestic roles again. And women were, in fact, fired in large numbers at the end of the war when the men returned. In the case of African Americans, they continue to face discrimination that they've been facing since African Americans had been on the continent in many areas of American life. They faced unfair treatment and employment opportunities in weapons factories. Black sailors could only work in ships' kitchens. Black soldiers could only train as officers, and the Air Force would train black fighter pilots. So what changed during the war? Under pressure from civil rights groups, FDR set up the Fair Employment Practice Committee, or the FECP, to have a look at the discrimination that the civil rights campaigners were complaining about in weapons factories. The FECP found widespread discrimination in these factories where African Americans were employed in lower percentages. They weren't getting paid as well. So what they did was they encouraged companies by recommending to the government which companies should be offered the best contracts. And they did that by, they offered those contracts to the companies that employed African Americans fairly. And this eventually led to better and fairer employment opportunities in those weapons factories. In the military, things also started to change. At the start of the war, as I said, they couldn't train as fighter pilots, and eventually that changed, and the Air Force did begin training fighter pilots, but still in black-only squadrons, so it was still segregated. Black officers could also lead segregated units, so they could be trained as officers, similar with the fighter pilots now, but again, in segregated units. And then towards the end of the war, in 1944, black and white soldiers did eventually begin to fight alongside one another where they hadn't before. An example of this is the Battle of the Bulge. So what happens at the end of the war? There was a renewed fight for civil rights because of the FECP's work. Black soldiers had proven themselves capable. The armed forces desegregated in 1948. So a few years after the war, they do eventually desegregate because of the impact that all of the black soldiers had had in the war. Civil rights groups, such as the NAACP, their membership skyrocketed, going from 50,000 to 450,000 members by the end of the war. Again, in part because the FECP had shown that civil rights campaigning could be effective, and also because African American soldiers or on the home front had been so vital to the war effort, and now they thought it's time for us to get our fair treatment at home as well. However, there also continued to be discrimination. Congress continued to block anti-lynching bills, and segregation remained in the US society in its southern states for a few decades to go. Right, so that's the social impact. These next two questions are mostly focused on the economic impact. So the War Production Board. Describe the role the War Production Board had in changing American economy during World War II, using at least one relevant example. So they created it was created to convert industries that were not set up for war work for war work. And then I've got a few examples for you. So car companies who previously built cars were converted to build tanks and fighter planes. Ribbon factories made parachutes for parachute units. And typewriter companies made machine guns. So we've got these domestic goods, and the equipment they have set up for making that was converted so it could make materials of war. How successful was the War Production Board during World War II, using at least one relevant statistic? So it was very successful. And then a couple of statistics to support this. So in 1943, US factories produced 86,000 planes and 96,000 in 1944, which was 28,000 more than Germany and Japan combined. So they were producing much more planes to be used in the war than both of their main opponents, which is obviously very important and will make the war effort much easier. It was also 50,000 more than what Roosevelt's target was. So that shows that it was successful even beyond the person who was leading this idea, even his own estimations of what would be achievable. What was the long-term impact of the War Production Board? There was a social and political legacy where that could now be seen to use its policies to solve big economic issues such as depression and conflict. Now, even during the New Deal, America still remained a country that was very skeptical of the idea of the government getting as involved as it did during the Second World War. So they remained a country that favoured smaller government involvement, smaller government spending. But during the war, they showed that how much the government could spend and how it could achieve things. An example to support this: before the war, the government spent 1% of its gross domestic product on its army. But since then, in 1945, it never dropped lower than 8%. So that shows that there was a change in the way that the government saw the importance of military spending. Okay, so the economic impact of World War II. In what ways did the groups benefit from America's involvement in the war? So there's 5 different groups here. So we'll talk through them all individually. So farmers prospered because they supplied food for the military. And this is a group, as you'll remember from the Depression and even during the boom years, that farmers continued to have a hard time in American society. But because of the war, farmers were prospering in a way they hadn't before. The unemployed. Large-scale production and the fighting required new workers between 1939 and 1944, which meant that unemployment dropped from 9.5 million in 1939 to just 670,000 in 1944. So there was a massive decrease in unemployment in a way that even the New Deal wasn't able to accomplish. Workers. So as demand for work increased, so did the wages. There was lots of work to be done, lots of weapons and materials that needed to be made for the war. So that meant that the factories needed to employ lots of people, and that means that the workers had better opportunity to demand higher wages for their work. Traditional industries such as coal, steel, and oil. So these were boosted by the demands of the war. Materials like that aren't as useful in peacetime, particularly with new technologies coming in. These traditional industries hadn't been doing as well, but they get a boost by the war. And then newer industries like Coca-Cola and Wrigley's Gum, they also found use for themselves during the war. Coca-Cola set up plants around the world to follow US troops, make sure that they can get a nice bottle of Coke in their rations. And Wrigley's gum took over the packing of soldiers' rations, and they included their chewing gum in those rations. Right, so those are the questions, and that's some of the key information on the changes that occurred during the Second World War. So we're now going to look at this exam style question. So what I've done is I've written these two PE paragraphs, and I've included two examples and an explanation of the long-term impact. So here's my point. So one way in which the lives of women changed during World War I was the increase in employment opportunities. And then I've backed that up. For example, as more women went to fight, more men went to fight, women had to fill their roles in the workforce, doing jobs in factories, railways, shipyards, and in 1945, women made up 1/3 of the workforce. So there I've got a relevant statistic and date as an example. And then I've included another example where I've talked about the women that joined the WASPs and that they flew planes from factories to military bases, and that 1,600 nurses received medals for working under fire. So I've included some more evidence about the work that women did actually in the military, as well as in the workforce supporting the military. But then I've said, because one of the things you need to talk about to get the highest marks is to consider this complex thinking idea again. So nonetheless, this was a short-term change, as returning soldiers often expected life to be as it had been and it's before the war, and expected their wives to return to domestic roles again. Women were fired in large numbers at the end of the war as the men returned, although it did create a precedent that would cause employment numbers of women to bounce back up later due to the feminist movement. This changed women's lives as they were more independent because they were earning their own money and not relying on their husbands to survive. So what I've done there is I've essentially used the one that's given as an example, where I've talked about how there was the changes in women working were short-lived, but what it did do is have a long-term impact by changing the expectations some women had of the kind of lives they could have, and their employment numbers did come back up again at a later date. And then I've done another one, African Americans. So I've done exactly the same thing, where I've got two examples and an explanation of the long-term impact. And I'll just run through this one a little bit quicker. So one way in which the lives of African Americans changed during World War II was a decrease in discrimination. For example, when the FECP found widespread discrimination in weapons factories, as a result of this, the FECP encouraged companies to change by offering the best contracts to companies that employed African Americans fairly. Furthermore, the Air Force eventually began to train fighter pilots, such as the Tuskegee Airmen, and black officers to lead segregated units. And then I've talked about the long-term impact here. Despite the continued segregation, World War II did create a significant long-term impact on the lives of African Americans, because the FECP's work created a renewed vigor in the fight for civil rights, as shown by the civil rights groups such as the NAACP, membership skyrocketing from 50,000 to 450,000 members by the end of the war. That would continue through the 1950s and 60s. And then I'll link back to the question. This changed African American women's lives as there were less barriers for them to participate in American society. So hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. I've tried to have it broken up so that the different sections of the question, so evidence, explanation, link, are kind of broken up into different lines for you to see. Compare this with your own answer. Think if you could add more specific evidence, or if you could maybe consider the short-term and long-term impacts, and make sure you've got a clear explanation of how their lives were changed as a result of those changes. Okay, hopefully this has been helpful for you, and you've finished up and you're ready and confident in your knowledge of the 1940s America, and you're ready to move on to your topic next week.